What's causing all this? Woo!
Put Scooter on the phone, you bird brain.
What do you do, backflips? You jump up there in a silly suit? What do you do?
You go BAM! I want you to play that. Attention all football fans. If you can't see your team play, come and dine with us and watch it live at Boardman, Canfield, or Cortland. Or staying at home, we'll deliver right to your door. That's Coca's Pizza. We serve it hot.
Afternoon, everybody. It's 3 o'clock and time to rock. Fast Freddie here. We are coming to you live and direct from the Youngstown studio here in downtown Youngstown, and another edition of Fast Freddie Rocks Youngstown. And we have two special guests here today, and I think this is going to be a great show today. I've been looking forward to this one. We've got former Vindicator editor Cynthia Rickard, right? Am I saying that right, Cynthia? Yep. Like I say, I'm terrible with names, even though I'm an announcer. if I butcher anything, just that's just the way it rolls.
That was perfect.
Okay, very good. And along with Cynthia, we have Bertram de Souza, longtime Youngstown Vindicator correspondent, columnist. And Bertram has a new book out called No Holds Barred. And what it is a collection of your columns over a 30-year period.
38 years. 36 years, I'm sorry.
Or you could probably say 30 odd years. Yeah. Very odd years when you're looking at the history of Youngstown. Yeah. Now, like on this show, I usually, I kind of stay away from politics because it has become so divisive out there now. It's not like if I disagree with you, I have to unfriend you. You can't be my friend. If we don't share the same view on something, now all of a sudden I got to call you a name and you're no longer my friend and I can't speak to you. Yeah. And like for me, it's more, motorcycles and rock music and pop culture, sports, and Youngstown history. And that's why I definitely wanted to have you on, because I look at this book and you have 300 columns over 30 odd years, and these columns pretty much sum up the history of Youngstown in that period.
Yes, they do. And it's interesting as you go through the book to see how history repeats itself in this region. I started writing in the 80s and was writing about political corruption. When we ended and when the Vindicator closed on August 31st, 2019, one of my last columns was about political corruption. It's as though decade after decade, it was the same story over and over again. But the book is not as political in the sense that it doesn't take sides. What it does, it shows you a sort of a landscape of our region over the decades. And also, there are some funny columns that I had written over the years that we've interspersed in the book just to break up the monotony of the columns.
Right. Now, you've been at this here for over 30 years. Right. Now, in the book, we talk about the closing of Lordstown, which was a huge story. Yes, it was. We talk about Jim Traficant. Of course, the corruption has been nonstop. Boy, like right there in the 90s when we hit that peak, it seemed like everybody went to jail. And of course, the centerpiece has got to be Jim Traficant.
It's chapter 1.
So you went right in there. You don't have to start from the back of the book, or it doesn't build up to this climax. We go with Big Jim right out of the box.
People don't realize I first met Jim Traficant when he was still a drug and alcohol counselor in the region, very well known. And as I point out in the book, the first time I met him, and you know Jim, he was a huge guy, big guy, and I'm small. So there was somebody in City Hall when I was covering Youngstown city government who said to me, I wanted to meet somebody because he knew I was from out of town. Mm-hmm. And he says, come to my house. So I went to his house and we're sitting there, and all of a sudden the door opens and there's this huge person filling the door frame. And he bounds in and I stood up and he grabs me in this bear hug and he says, I'm Jim Traficant. I'm going to be a congressman. And I looked at him, and I'd covered other politicians around the country before that. Right. And I thought, this is another blowhard. But then the next experience I had of him is somebody called me up and said, you better go to Fitch High School. Jim Traficant is going to be talking to kids about drug use. And it was, a noon sort of assembly, and it was in the auditorium. I walk in, and there were more adults than there were kids. And he walked onto the stage, and for an hour, without notes, talked. And I went, wow, there's something to this guy. And so I followed him, his career. I wrote about him. And I will say, we had a love-hate relationship. He knew that the paper was important, but he also knew that he was a congressman. But
he never belittled us. He never belittled the press.
But the problem with Jim Traficant was he was so Youngstown that he surrounded himself with people who didn't have his best interest. And you know the dangers of that.
Oh, exactly.
Especially for a politician. And one day I asked him, I said, why don't you get rid of all of these people? I said, you're in Washington, D.C. They got professional staffs. They got great guys. And he says, I'm loyal to my friends. That loyalty was what brought him down.
I think so. That was like a, an admirable trait, but it was also his downfall. But it's funny that you talk about Jim, though, with he'd always put somebody in a bear hug or give you a noogie or, squeeze you, twist your arm, something like that.
He was that uncle or grandparent that you didn't want to be around.
But I remember, there's two stories. You're talking about his thing about the when he went on the big campaign against drugs. Right. And to this day, one of my buddies hates Jim Traficant because Jim at the time was putting out these little cards for parents, like signs that your child might be using drugs, okay? And I think a couple of them were like, spends time alone in his bedroom with the door closed. Well, when this guy's mom caught him in an embarrassing situation, from that point on, he didn't want anything to do with Jim because he wasn't messing with drugs, he was messing with himself. And mom come in because they're looking at the card. Oh, yeah, you know what? Yeah, he's been in that bedroom there alone, and I hear that loud rock music. And there was just a bunch of different signs for that.
But you're a biker. You're right. A lot of the bikers in this region loved him.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I used to go to events when, he was a hero. He'd walk into a room filled with bikers, and they would just love to be around him and hang around him.
And the presence that he had, like you mentioned, when that guy walked into a room, it was like, okay, Jim Traficant is here. When we would have him on the radio station, when he come busting in there, it was just like, here we go, it was like the door would, like you say, the door would be kick open like he was on a raid, and the next thing you know, he took over the place, grabbing the mic or whatever.
And I think you'll see in the book, the chapter, the columns about Jim Traficant, people assume they're all going to be negative, and they're not. I talk about the things that he did. I talk about all the progress that he made. I talk about the courthouses, the air base, the airport. Jim Traficant made a name for himself. And I'll tell you a story about Jim, just the kind of guy he was. Obviously, he did not like the Vindicator because we didn't support him. We never endorsed him. And he always resented that. And it hurt him a great deal because he wanted the support of the daily newspaper. But during the ethics hearing, when they were expelling him, I went to Washington. I was on vacation, and I decided, how better to spend my vacation than go to work. Go to the ethics hearing. And I walk in behind him, and he knew the name of every doorman or woman, every aide, every assistant, every staffer, and they'd all come up to him and shake, and there were all these other members of Congress who weren't paying attention to these guys. And I thought, that is Jim Traficant. And it was sort of, it said something about him, about his roots, about who he was.
Especially about his roots, because I think that's one thing, you were saying about him being loyal to his friends. That's typical Mahoning Valley. I think. You can go all over the world and travel anywhere, and you find people who still long for this area, for their hometown. And I think that's why, because there is that loyalty and that kind of sense of community and family.
That's one thing that I think about all the time, because Jim Traficant actually grew up right up the street from us on Samuel Street, on the south side on Samuel Street. And when you looked at that neighborhood, Traficant lived up the street. Chuck Perizich, the former Vindicator editor, lived right across the street from us. George Vukovich lived right next door to us. And there was a certain thing, and I think I'm that way too. It's just something about the people that lived there. And Tom Holden lived right up the hill. These were all like Wilson High School guys and stuff. And I think there's just something from like growing up in that area and growing up in that neighborhood. Now, like Chuck Perizich, here's another good example. I can remember, when I was a kid, and him and my mom were good friends, and when he would write his columns, it'd always include something about somebody from high school, and my mom go, hey, look, they mentioned Rich Buzzin in there or whatever. Oh, we went to school with him, and he always had that personal thing. And I would remember seeing him sitting at McDonald's on South Avenue or on Midlothian, and Chuck Perizich would be sitting in there, and he'd be wearing like a Cleveland Browns jersey and a ball cap, and he'd have 10, 12 guys, just regular guys, sitting around there holding court, talking sports and everything. And to me, that showed like how you got to treat people.
Yeah, those are the guys who used to show up at the Vindicator as well when we were in the old building to see Chuck. There was Red Angelo and all those guys who used to come in every Friday afternoon, sit around Chuck, and that's where he got all of his information about local things. But if you talked about George Vukovic, who was mayor of Youngstown. Right. If everybody was like him, he had a spit in his basement. I don't know if you know where he would make roast pig. And one night he invited me to his house he said we're going to have a pig roast. And I go there and I'm looking in the backyard, there's nothing there. And he says, oh, come on in. And it was in the basement. And he says, everybody in this neighborhood does this. But, Jim Traficant, very much like Chuck, knew a lot of local people. Yeah. And if you remember, Traficant had a Sunday show on television, 33. If somebody died in this area, he knew everybody about that family. He knew all of the names. He knew little anecdotes about the people. I mean, that was similar to what Chuck used to do.
Yeah,
And I think that's what people like.
And and I think Tom Holden was the same kind of guy too. Yes. If you would see him at the fireplace or something, there was no pretension about these guys, and they were just guys from the neighborhood. They were guys from the South Side, from the neighborhood, and that's just how they went about their business. And like you say, when you see Traficant down there and knew every one of those doormen and things, and that's one thing I'd always get if we ever had Traficant on the show, people would run into me or see me other places or even call in and say, you know what, I had a problem with the VA. My son has something jammed up in the Army, or I had a problem with this or that, or Social Security, the VA. And they would always sit there and say, you know what, Traficant got on the case for me. And,
who the person was who used to do that was Commissioner Traficant, who worked for Jim. That constituency service, they had the best office, I think, in Congress, because they responded quickly, especially to senior citizens. And so every time I'd write a negative column about Traficant, I'd get calls from senior citizens who would tell me how wrong I was about this guy because how much help they got. And you're right, that's what he did. I mean,
just surrounded himself with the wrong people, though. Hey, this is my buddy. I got to help him out or whatever. Yeah. And I think you see that a lot in pro sports, too, where a lot of these guys were loyal to their friends from the hood or wherever it may be. And these guys were just bad influences. But, it's...
Well, LeBron James is one in particular. He has all of his buddies, his childhood buddies he surrounded himself with. He's been criticized for it, but they seem to be doing a pretty good job for him.
Right. I think, I think with LeBron it is, but I think you see so many things in sports where a guy comes home to a funeral for a friend and gets jammed up with something, or something happens, or there's a police raid, and you just happen to be visiting your cousin, and you don't want to come across like, I can't have anything to do with these people. I can't be seen with these people. I got to cut loose. But sometimes there is that. You got to draw that line where, like, dude,
you do have to draw the line. Ed O'Neill, the actor, who's from here, Ursuline. He comes to town, and no fanfare, and he's friends with Tony Caferros, and they all get together. And they have, they sit around, they talk, they smoke cigars, and tell old stories, and then he leaves. And there's never, this controversy surrounding him, because I know some of the people who join them, too. Right. But, that's the kind of, I would have hoped that Traficant realized that once he went to Washington, it wasn't local politics. Yeah. Right. It was a different ball game. And, I realized that he and Chuck Cronesti were very close. I realized he and some others were very close. But they weren't professional. They took their mentality to Washington.
And he could have put them in lesser positions and kept a closer eye on them. was his failure.
And so I think the book sort of reflects that you as you read through the columns about the chapter on trafficking, there is regret, my regret, that here was a man, I believe, had he kept his nose clean. Everybody remembers Mike Kerwin, the congressman from this area,
right?
Iron Mike. I think Jim Traficant could have been there as long, or if not longer, and would have today been in one of the leaders on Capitol Hill.
No, I believe it. Do you think he would have actually had a shot at the presidency when you see Trump and how he got in?
He did. Traficant did run for president.
Yes.
I followed him to New England, and he had these little coffee klatches, and it was great. And I talked to the people there, and they said, we need somebody like him to tell us how it is. And I wrote about it, and he used to see me in the audience and make fun of me about it.
Yeah.
Look, they sent him. He didn't have anything to do at home, so they sent him to follow me, and I'd go write about him. But in those days, he was talking about the issues that Trump won on in 2016: China, unfair trade practices, immigration, open borders.
Oh, yeah.
All of those issues that Jim Traficant raised when he went to Washington is what Trump adopted in 2016.
And you know what I think is, I hear some people say, Trump's a lot like Traficant. I think Trump is not like Traficant, because I don't think Trump would give those guys the time of day, the regular working stiffs in Congress and things like that. I'll bet there's people in the White House that he doesn't even know their names and had no reason. I think the difference between the two, one was the son of a truck driver and the other was the son of a millionaire, and I think there's a little bit of difference there.
I was talking to a Trump supporter who worked for GM, retired at GM, so gets a new car every couple of years, still does, from GM and all of that. And he was telling me about Trump, about, what a great guy, and he cares about the working class. And I looked at this guy and I said, let me tell you something about Donald Trump. Do you realize he has never stood in line for anything in his life? He said, what are you talking about? I said, he went to a private school. His father was a millionaire. If he went to a restaurant, they'd pick up the phone and say, Trump is coming in, and he'd go into to a special entrance. If you went to a movie theater, the tickets were all, reserved for him. I said, the guy doesn't know what the working man is. But he comes across as somebody who cares. Traficant knew what it was like to work. Traficant knew what blue-collar work was. And I think that's what endeared him to a lot of people in this region. Yeah, I think he was the real deal when it come to relating to the working man. And I think that's what the reason behind his success. Some people could come off as like playing the populist card, and there are other people that are actually, walking the walk. Sure. So, and he had a great sense, and also a great sense of timing as well. After the first trial where he beat the federal government when he was sheriff, everybody thought, okay, he's going to go back and he's going to go and sit down in some corner and just be sheriff and all of that. And the moment he won, he recognized what that win meant. And I know all kinds of stories about him during that trial. I think you remember he was defending himself when he was accused of taking money from the Mafia. And the prosecutor, the federal prosecutor, was highly educated, very good-looking guy. He wore pinstripe suits, white shirt, power ties, and all of that in the courtroom. Traficant would walk in with his bell-bottoms and his corduroy jacket and his narrow ties.
And his hair.
And so one day, and I was told this by somebody who was in the room, one day after the trial, he goes to the hotel room, and one of the women who was assisting him took his jacket, and she had needle and thread. And he looks over and he says, what are you doing? And she says, this patch on your elbow has torn loose. It's torn loose. I need to, and he said, leave it alone. And she said, what do you mean leave it alone? He said, you don't realize the jury's looking at this, and they're looking at that guy with the pinstripe suit, and they're looking at me with this patch falling off. And guess who they're going to feel sorry for?
Smart guy.
Absolutely. And I started laughing. I said, my God, who would have thought that? But how big is that for a guy to represent himself and beat the feds? How often does that happen? Exactly, yeah. And
that was amazing. It was really.
And I think that might have went to his head a little too much, because I heard some people had offered to defend him even for free. Yes. And a lot of people. He did have
assistants. I mean, he had legal advisors while he was doing it. But they did offer to defend.
But he never. Han, I would call him up. Say, hey, this is what you need to do, and he'd say to Don, yeah, if you're a lawyer, you do this. But if you're not, this is how you have to do it. Because I'm looking at he says, I'm not playing to the judge. I'm not playing to the prosecutors. I'm playing to the jury. And, they had the jury foreman was from Girard.
Right.
And so, that was another mistake they made. They didn't realize, the feds didn't realize what a mistake
Yeah,
was.
Exactly. Now there's another name you bring up, Don Hanai. You got any columns in there about Don Hanai? Now, so what was your relationship with the Bull Moose? Because he was a character, another character.
First of all, as you know, he loved to drink. And when I took over politics, the person I replaced had been in that position for 50 years. And was Clinton Jackson.
Yeah, right.
Everybody knew him. He was well known. He ran for office while he was politics editor of the Vindicator.
That was a different day in journalism.
All of those kinds of things. So I was the first person to take over politics in a half century. And I came in, I'd worked elsewhere and all, and I sort of told the owners of the paper, we need to change how we cover politics. We need to become more professional. We need to have standards and ethics and stuff like that. So Hanai was chairman of the party. And his rule was, if I wanted to talk to him, I had to meet him in a bar.
Okay.
By the way, Cindy and I used to be married, so
you never told me that.
We're divorced now, but so I spent a lot of time in the bars.
Yeah.
Because that's where he would talk to me.
Yes, he did.
And he was very good politically. He had great political instincts. Again, though, he was a lawyer, one of the best criminal lawyers in the region, if not in the state. You know that.
Right.
I mean, he was just a great criminal lawyer, did a lot of homework. I used to know, when he prepared for a case, it was 24/7 for weeks before the case began. I mean, he was just that good. But politically also, he was a wheeler and dealer. I mean, there were always people, knocking on his door or going in back.
Yeah.
So there's one of the columns in the book was when I first met Joey Naples, the mobster. I'm at my desk and the phone rings, and it's Hanai's secretary. He says, "Hey, Don wants you to come over right now. He wants to see you." And I thought, oh, he's got some information. He's got a statement to give me, and I need to go over there. So I go over there, and I go up the stairs to his office, and his secretaries all there. They have these big smiles on their face. I walk into the room, and there's Joey Naples standing there. And Hanai says to me, Bertram de Souza, meet Joey Naples. And Naples looks at me and he says, and you call me little Joey? And I started laughing. And I said, Mr. Naples out to me. He lives on the north side, just a couple of streets from where I live, Joey Naples said. So we used to see him walk his dog on the north side. But Hanai had no qualms about bringing in the political writer to meet the mob boss. I mean, he didn't think there was anything wrong with that.
Right.
And remember at the Calamar when Jimmy Prado, when they found the surveillance equipment for the FBI after the big rain,
right.
and the ceiling started leaking, and so they pulled down the ceiling, and here were all these cameras and all of that.
Yeah.
Hanai calls me up and he says, let's go have lunch. And I said, where? And he says, and bring the managing editor, Paul Jagnos. Bring Paul. He said, I'll take you guys to lunch. He takes us to the Calamar, introduces us to Jimmy Prado. And he says, Jimmy, meet these guys. And he had in his mind, he was a criminal lawyer. He defended these guys. There was nothing wrong. And he wanted them to know that he had contacts with the newspaper and with me. And so I used to write, nasty things about him, and he would make speeches about me, and tell me to go back to my, go back on my elephant from where I came from, and he'd be abusive, and
right.
I'd write nasty things, and Cindy would get angry because she'd hear all of those stories. But I think politically, he made this region important, especially for the Democratic Party. Because presidential candidates, gubernatorial candidates, senatorial candidates all knew that this was such a strong Democratic stronghold, and Hanai was such a strong chairman, they had to come here to visit. Because they needed a big vote out of the Mahoning Valley, especially Mahoning County,
right, in
order to win statewide. That was you had to have at least 65% out of this area in order to win statewide. Hanai was able to deliver those votes.
That's huge.
It's huge.
Well, I mean, when you see guys like Traficant and Hanai, these guys, you couldn't create that. If you were sitting there writing a novel, I don't think you could come up with two guys like that.
Exactly. And that's why I think the book reflects that. People will read the book, read the columns about Hanai, read the columns about Traficant, and they'll get that idea that, these were guys who knew what they were doing, were good at what they were doing. And I think that's sort of the...
Now, when you're writing about these guys and you had these somewhat adversarial relationship, you had to have a thick skin about that, didn't you?
Oh, absolutely. And but fortunately for me, when you don't have kids, and I don't have children,
right?
And your parents are not here, and you don't have, and I used to make this derogatory statement. I don't have any idiot relatives on the public payroll who can be threatened. That's what they used to do. You know that.
Yeah, right.
If you had somebody on the public payroll and you didn't toe the line, if I wanted you to do something, your relative's job was in jeopardy.
Yeah, you're not working at the water department tomorrow or whatever.
And then you know how those jobs were.
Oh, yeah.
And so they couldn't threaten me that way.
And they couldn't threaten his wife because I was a journalist as well.
Yeah, right. So when we were married, she was a journalist as well. And I used to make the statement, I'm not from here, even though I lived here 40 years.
Right.
When I came here I'd done my master's at Marquette University in political science. And when I came here, I tell people I had 2 suitcases and some recycled furniture. Today I have 3 suitcases and a little bit of furniture, so I'm ahead of the game.
Yeah, there you go. The extra suitcase and the furniture's a little nicer.
That's it. But, and I never wanted. I mean, I said I've never took bribes. I didn't do it. People would want to do favors for us, would want to, office stuff. And I said no. I was writing about some prominent businessman and did a lot of columns about him. And one of his friends one day called me up and said, what will it take for you to just get off this thing? You're offending him, you're offending his family, and they're all getting upset. And why won't you just get off? What will it take? And I said, what do you mean? And I like the guy who was talking to me, and he wasn't trying to threaten me in any way. He was just saying, what will it take? And I said, I'll tell you what. I said, tell him $1 million in a Swiss bank account, and I'm gone.
Yeah, very easy.
He looked at me and he says, I guess you're not leaving. I said, no.
Well, obviously, that I'm not that important, so I guess not. Now, have you ever had any people just physically threaten you and things like that? Have you?
One time I was at downtown post office. Ernie Biandello, the mobster.
Right.
After he was killed, I did a column that was in bad taste because I sort of started making fun of Ernie and his not having a good mobster nickname and stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know. Sometimes some things get over me, and I just write, and then I look at it in the paper and I think, oh my God, what did I write? And I'm in the post office, and his nephew came up to me.
It's like, uh-oh.
And got into my face, and he said, if you don't watch it,
yeah,
you're not going to make it. And I said, listen. I said, I've been around this business a long time. These things don't bother me. And he's just funny. He says, you've hurt the family a great deal. Mostly they would call up the owners of the newspaper and demand that I get fired.
Right.
Or they would threaten to pull advertising.
But there were a lot of death threats over the years.
Yeah.
There was
and one time there was, after they had killed Joey Naples, the FBI picked up conversation between some mob guys who were talking about, well, the next one we have to go after is that De Souza from the Vindicator. So the FBI called me up and they said, hey, we've picked up this conversation. We can help you. We can give you. And once again, that's why there's a chapter called Gallows Humor. My gallows humor kicked in and I said, listen. I said, if you remember the Paul Gaines attempted murder, I said, these were mob guys. These were guys who were hired by mobsters who actually the shooter went into Gaines's house, shot him once. Gaines is on the floor, standing over Gaines with a gun, and the gun doesn't fire, it misfires. I said, these guys are so incompetent. I said, I'm such a small damn target. They'll never hit me. The FBI agent said, fine.
Right. Yeah, that was some crazy stuff there. So, so we're talking about Hanai. Now, the mob in Youngstown. Now, let's talk a little bit about that because I know people just love to talk about the mob in Youngstown. Joey Naples, Sandy Naples, Cadillac Charlie, Prado, the Crab.
There are pictures galore in this book.
Yeah.
So, in fact, there's a chapter on the Mafia and my relationship with them, my talking about their influence, especially politically, you've been here long enough. They had, their goal always was to own the sheriff, because that's where they were able to operate their after-hours joints. That's where they were able to operate their gambling and all of that. And I tell people this who are not from this area. When I first came to town, I had been in Milwaukee, where there also is organized crime, but it wasn't as blatant as it's here. So when I first came to town, there was a wedding, a wedding stag. This is for the group.
Right.
And I got a call from somebody who said, hey, there was a stag for this guy who was getting married. And guess who were running the tables? And I said, what are you talking, running the tables? He said, the bar boot and the dice games and all of that. I said, who? He said, Joey Naples guys. I said, you mean the mobsters guys? He says, yeah, they do it for all stags in the region. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, oh, yeah. He says, you have a stag. Then that's to get money for the groom and the couple and all of that. Oh, yeah. And the mob guys ran the tables, and they'd take their cut. So I started making inquiries. And one day I come to find out a police department in our area were having a fundraiser, and they had the mobsters running the table.
Only in Youngstown, practically. Camel seemed to be the heart of it all, Yes. But that's funny. We were talking about that the other day. You're from Youngstown if you know what bar boot is. I was 5 years old living in Youngstown. I knew what a bar boot game was. That's how crazy it is. Yeah. What do you think the fascination of the city of Youngstown with gambling is? I mean, we have been fascinated with gambling. From
Youngstown, the whole country gambles on sports every single weekend. It's not just. But I
think Youngstown's was because of the steel mills and the numbers runners. I mean, I'm sure guys who are now adults who were running numbers when they were kids.
Oh, sure.
For the mobsters.
Right.
We all do. And they'd all stand outside the gates of the steel mills on Friday when these guys would get paid, and they'd write numbers. And you played with it. And so when I came to town, I didn't realize what gambling with the mob meant. Yeah. So one day a guy comes up to me and says, do you play the 3-digit number on the Ohio lottery? I said, yeah. And he says, if you play $1 straight and you hit, you'll get $500, right? I said, yeah. He says, if you play $1 straight with the mob, you get $600. But if you don't pay them, they'll break your knee. I said, okay.
For the extra $100, kneecaps are really repairable now.
And he used to say, come on, play with me. And I'd say, no, I'm not playing with you. I said, I'll play with the Ohio Lottery. But everybody knew. I mean, the Briar Hill Festival, on the north side, St. Anthony Church. First time I remember, I was invited to the festival by somebody who ended up being on Traficant's payroll, by the way. And she calls me up and she says, you have to come to the Briar Hill Festival. All the politicians will be there. So I go. And there's this long table, and there are all these guys sitting at the table. And I'm going to, I tend to do this. They all had pinky rings, and they had those gold chains around their necks. But anyway, they're all sitting at these.
Wait a minute, I got that. Wait, you mean me? Hey, I'm Ukrainian. I'm not Italian, though, but I take offense to that.
And I never knew what the thing was at the end of the gold thing. I thought it was a pepper.
Oh my God.
But anyway, so they're all sitting there, and there's a line of people, and some of them are actually kissing these guys' rings. And so I turned to the person I was with, and I said, what the hell is all that about?
Yeah.
And he started naming all the mobsters. He said, they all sit here. This is their festival. Politicians will come in. And if you remember when Joey Naples died, his mass, mass of Catholic burial, that I'm a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, his mass was at St. Anthony, and Monsignor Diomarenus was the one who did the eulogy and talked about Joey being such a wonderful family man. And I wrote a column saying...
well, but that had to ruffle some feathers there somewhere, huh?
After that column, I got a call from several leaders of the Italian community, and they wanted to have a meeting with me. I was friends.
Sit down, was it a meeting or a sit down? There's a little bit
Actually,
different.
it wasn't the church.
Sometimes sit downs, people don't come back from sit downs. You can come back from a meeting.
Joey Naples' cousin, the councilman, lived down the street from me. So his name was also Joey. And he was a nice guy, very school teacher, well educated and all of that. He calls me up and he said, Bertram, we have to meet, you have to have a sit down and talk to us about this. So I go there to St. Anthony Church, and we're in the basement, in the hall, and Monsignor de Morenas is there. There's somebody from the Cafaro Company was there. Joey Naples was there, a couple of other people. And they had all of this literature about the Italian heritage and Christopher Columbus and all of these people. And they started this conversation about why I hate Italians.
Oh, okay.
That is the general feeling in town. I still hear it, that you hate Italians.
And I said, first of all, look at me, I'm ethnic.
Right. Yeah.
Let's not talk about hating ethnics here.
Yeah.
I said, and number two, I said, I don't write about the Italian community. It's unfortunate that, all of the mobsters are Italian, of Italian heritage. I didn't create that. By the same token, I pointed this out. If you remember, there was a mobster by the name of Bernie Altschuler.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bernie the Jew.
I used to call, in my columns, I used to call him Bernie the Jew Altschuler.
Right.
And one day I got a call from I was at Kravitz Deli.
Oh,
an Indian guy
okay.
at Kravitz Deli.
Yeah.
I'm at Kravitz Deli, and this very prominent Jewish lawyer came out and he said, the Jewish community resents the fact that you use his nickname every time you write about it. I said, but that's how they all listen to the tapes. They don't call him Bernie.
Yeah.
They listen to the Stroller tapes. They say, oh, contact the Jew. They don't say contact Bernie Altschuler.
Right.
And he says, I'll tell you what. He says, we have some of the most dedicated readers of the Vindicator. We don't care if you write about him. Just don't use the Jew. He said, because you don't use the Italian or the Bentinos
there's
or whatever.
A lot of different nicknames
and I
you
said,
could go
I use
there.
Nicknames. He says, yeah, you use nicknames, but those are the nicknames they have, like Cadillac Charlie and stuff like that. Charlie the Crab and Ronnie the Crab.
Right.
But he said, this is the only one where you actually call him the Jew, and that's offensive to the Jewish community. And I stopped doing it. And that's the only time I think I ever stopped, because I thought perhaps he's right in the sense that that's one reference that actually does come close to being,
Right.
Yeah.
But with mobsters and stuff, the nickname was the whole thing. I always thought, that was part of the game, man. You had to have a nickname, and everybody did. And it's
did
just
a column on that, actually.
Oh, you did? Tell me a little bit about. Is this in the book?
In the book.
Tell me just a little bit about it, because we don't want to give away too much stuff in the book.
I was talking about all these. You're not a true mobster unless you have a really good nickname.
Right.
And I went through this Cadillac Charlie, Charlie the Crab, Ronnie the Crab, Little Joey Naples,
right?
Jimmy Bry Hill, Jimmy Prado, and then I said, and then you have Ernie Biondello. What kind of mobster name is Ernie?
Right.
And I don't think his family appreciated
Next thing
that.
you know, I'm at the post office, and a very large Italian-looking man with a pinky ring and a gold chain decides to question me a little bit about my column.
Yeah, but I knew them. I mean, I knew the mobsters because there was a rule, and it was an unwritten rule a long time, was if there are you don't hurt the families of mobsters. And that's when the feds came in, if you remember, when we became, Crime Town, USA. Because family, the Caballero kids got killed, and
right.
When those things occurred, I think it crossed the line. And there was also the unwritten rule: you don't go after journalists. You can resent anything you want, you can talk about them and all of that, but they're doing their job. You understand that, and
part of the game.
It was part of the game. And so when Lenny Strollo ended up, becoming a government snitch, I did a ton of columns about being a snitch.
Yeah.
But we had a mutual friend. And so I said to this mutual friend, listen, so Lenny's out of prison. He's old. Tell him I'd like to sit down with him. I'll do a video interview with him. And I promise I won't release it until after his death. But I want to talk to him about his life in the mob, as a mob boss.
Right.
And so this friend goes to see Lenny, and Lenny says, tell De Souza to F you. I've made more profit for the newspaper because of his writing about me than he's worth. I'm not going to talk to him. But, they realized. I mean, they used to read the stuff I wrote. They knew what I was writing. But,
Yeah, I find that pretty amazing. Let's go back here a little bit. So you go into Hannah's office, and Joey Naples is sitting there. What was that conversation like? Was it just an introduction, or what did you guys talk about?
We both used to see him on the north side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Of course, he had bulletproof glass on his house.
Right.
All his windows
And his
were bulletproof.
car.
And his car.
His windows darkened.
Yes.
Windows in the car were darkened.
And, Pinto was his bodyguard.
Yeah.
Very pleasant. He says, "Yeah, I see."
Another great nickname.
I see you. You write about, and writing about me, and I said, I'm just doing my job. Wasn't abusive, and was soft spoken, which is different for these, And basically said, hey, you do what you have to do, and I said thank you, and I didn't. I said something about the Mafia, and he just shook his head, didn't say anything.
Right.
And that was the extent of the conversation. I asked Jimmy Prado about the Mafia.
Uh-huh.
There's a chapter in the book about when my father got very ill in England.
A column.
A column.
Yeah.
My father was very ill with ALS, with Lou Gehrig's,
right,
outside London. My mother and father were living there. And Prado found out, and I think Hannah was the one who told Prado. So one day, Prado's wife calls me up and says, Jimmy would like to see you. And I used to go and hang out there every Saturday, just hoping that I'd get an interview with Jimmy Prado.
Right.
And so I thought, oh my God, this is it. I'm going to get this interview. And I go there, and Prado calls me into his office, and I sat down, and I had my notebook out, my tape recorder and everything. And he says, no. He said, I want to talk to you about personal things. And I said, huh? And he said, I heard your father's very ill. He said, I'd like to have a fundraiser for him, and we'll raise the money, and we'll bring him to America, and we'll send him to a specialist in Houston that I know, to take care. And I looked at him and I said, no, thank you. I appreciate it. It's very, and I wrote a column about that.
Well, that's pretty big of you. I mean, I think some people would have jumped on that in a heartbeat.
I said, I just can't do it. I said, I said, there's a certain lines I will not cross, and and though it's my father, and I'm sure he'd get wonderful treatment here. My mother's looking after him. My sister's looking after him. It's tough, but
and once you open that door, then you're obligated. And I think you always want to be in that situation. Well, you know what? That's how the mob operated. They always try to get you to owe them something.
Yes.
I mean, that's like one of the basic principles of the mob. Get them to owe you something. And that, I even found that sometimes in like the radio business or something, or somebody not like payola or anything to play a song or whatever, but just like things in general to maybe give me a mention or whatever. And I never really wanted to feel obligated to people, because in the back of your mind you get that little sense there's something in there that you sit there and go, this guy took care of it. Oh, well, here's one of my favorites. Maybe that's a Youngstown thing. One of my favorites was friends helping friends. It wasn't corruption. Exactly. It was friends helping friends. That was like the mantra of the Mahoning Valley. I'm not doing anything corrupt. It's just friends helping friends. What's wrong with that? Is that so bad? And then we get this guy writing articles because I'm just trying to help out my buddy.
That is exactly it. One of the judges talked about when he was getting bribed, he needed lunch money.
Yeah.
That was
Hey, I'm working on the farm because I need some exercise. Look at this right here.
That's exactly that's what the Traficant and the others talked about. Cindy used to keep the checkbook, so she realized how much money I spend, because if somebody, when you go to lunch and somebody buys, my rule always was the next time, there had to be a next time, and I would buy.
Right.
So there wasn't any debt owed.
And journalism is not the business to get into if you want to make money.
Exactly.
So there were a lot of arguments about when those bills started piling in, when you were buying the millionaires in town.
Wait, what were you doing at the Calamar? I like the meatballs. Remember, that was another thing. That was the meatballs.
The meatball defense. Mike Pope, who was the county treasurer.
That's one. That's a Mahoning Valley defense. I was there for the friends helping friends.
Yeah.
I was there for the meatballs, and then of course the one that is still a part. You know, you're from Youngstown if you know what pulling a hand-eye means. When he went through the post office,
absolutely.
you run to a bar and drink some so they can't get you.
Here's the inside story. So Hannah and I had been drinking that evening. He leaves the bar. Okay?
Here we go.
He leaves the bar, and he was really...
Yeah.
So he drives into the post office, and the phone stopped ringing, and everybody's saying, okay.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing he does is he gets out. Now, if you remember, there was the English pub in the parking deck.
Right.
Okay? So he decides, he gets out of his car, he goes out. The first thing he sees this bush. Okay, and he starts pulling leaves out and starts chewing the leaves.
The pine needles.
And then he goes into the English pub and he says, give me 3 double shots of vodka. And he drowns and they say, what's the matter? He says, I'm shaken. And he starts drinking those. So when the cops came to him, the bartender says, yeah, I just served him 3 doubles. And
poor Bassett was so shook up.
I know.
Now, that shows you what kind of an attorney that guy was. You were talking about how sharp his mind was and how well prepared he was. You know, and to this day, that's still in Youngstown called pulling a hand-eye.
Yeah. They had to put these huge metal bars in front of the post office.
That's a classic Youngstown story right there.
And that story made it around the state because I've written about it and all of that. People in the state office would be calling me up and saying, "Oh, is this for real?" I'd say, "Yeah."
Yep, Youngstown, Ohio.
Yep.
Youngstown, Ohio. There's some incredible things that I think happened in Youngstown that didn't happen anywhere else. You know, and I think for a journalist, you were actually kind of lucky to be in this environment, in this like dysfunctional environment that was going on. There was always something happening.
I've always tell people when I came to the Vindicator, I had gotten my master's and I'd applied for jobs all over the country. And I applied here, and they called me up and they said, you know, come in for a tryout. You know, we'll pay your airfare from Milwaukee and we'll put you up at the hotel, but we'd like you to stay for the week. And I had worked previously in Selma, Alabama, worked for the newspaper there prior to going to get my master's. And so I came here, spent a week. And at the end of the week, they said, we'd like to offer you a job if you'd like to come and work for us. And I said, fine. I said, but let me just tell you this. I'm not from here. I don't have family. And I only intend to stay 2 years.
Famous last words. I know that song.
They said, oh, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Yeah. We understand. And truth be told, when I started, there were like 4 other journalists who were hired by the paper. At that time, they were hiring all kinds of people.
Oh, right, right.
And there were 4 others who were not from this area who had been hired as reporters. They all left, you know, after a couple of years or 4 years or 5 years to go on to other things. I was fortunate because A, I love politics. B, I loved organized crime. And C, I loved writing a column. And all those three things I was able to get at the Vindicator. And then, of course, I met Cindy, and, you know, being another journalist and, you know, sort of sharing our passion for the news business.
Oh, yeah. So it's a cool thing.
And so, you know, I stayed, you know, and people who had left would still call me up sometimes and say, you're still there.
I'll say with me in the radio business. I was here 40 years in the radio business. Yeah. But once again, it's like you, if you're in a good situation, you know, I'm never going to be Howard Stern or whatever. And
well, I remember a conversation that you had with our managing editor at the time, Annie Preslomsky. And he had asked her advice about whether he should leave or not. And it just seemed every time when we were married, every time we went to leave, one of us got promoted. So it kind of, you know, waylaid that. But he went to Annie at one point and asked her advice if he should go. And she said, you have to decide if you want to be a big fish in a little pond or a little fish in a big pond. Because he had experiences here in this size of a market that he would have never gotten, or would have had to wait decades to get to in a bigger market.
Oh, I know. I mean, it's the same. I feel that same way, like in my position, and things that I got to do, and like I say, it was never Howard Stern or anything, but I had a lot of fun. I met a lot of people just like you, and especially in the music business, and had a chance to go to concerts and different things and sporting events that I would have never had a chance to go to probably.
And you could afford to go to them because we lived in an area where it didn't cost a fortune to live.
I think that's the one of the best assets of this area is that it's so affordable.
Yes,
and you're close to Cleveland, you're close to Pittsburgh, you're driving distance away. If you live in some of these big cities, you might drive that to work from Cleveland to Youngstown in a day. So what's the big deal if you want to go see a concert, you want to go see sporting events? You got Cleveland and Pittsburgh, you got Lake
Plus
Erie.
You're midway between New York and Chicago.
It's just such a great location. So what do you now? You wrote about the closing of GM because this we'll head down this road too about why maybe this area hasn't been able to grow, and despite all the positives that we have. Now, did things like the mob, do you think had a bad perception and kept people from locating here?
In the early days, yes. In the early days, when the mob was very active, it affected economic development and job creation, absolutely. Because I used to, in addition to covering the mob, in addition to writing about politics, I also enjoyed writing economic development stories. And I got involved in a lot of the projects like in downtown Youngstown and projects around, remember the accounting center, regional center that Traficant won, and Bill Clinton promised us.
You know what? That's what this ink pen. I thought I was going to be the guy that signs the checks. I was, I was right there, man.
And Bill Clinton promised it, and then broke his promise. But every time when I would get what sort of happened with the newspapers, the Vindicator was such a significant, had such a significant presence in the region that companies that wanted to locate here would invariably call some of us at the paper to say, tell us about the background and all of that. The calls I would get were, how influential is organized crime in local government, and do we have to pay in order to get licenses and stuff like that? And that was a reputation, and I think the chamber realized that, and the Citizens League of Greater Youngstown, that the grassroots organization realized that was a negative for us. It was difficult to get over that, especially with the mob gone, it's sort of different. The other problem we had, I think, is, and I wrote about this, when the mills closed, we weren't ready. Because nobody thought the steel mills would ever close in the Mahoning Valley.
Me for one. I lived right at the gate. That's where I grew up, right on Poland Avenue, to Stop 5 gate. And it's just the massive size of that alone. You're like, how could something this big and noisy, and how could this ever end? How could you shut that down? What do you mean it would shut down?
And you knew, cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents all used to work in the mill. You'd get out of high school, and if your father worked for the mill, you'd get a job at the mill. So you didn't think about going on to college. You didn't think about doing all of the other things. But when the mills closed, we were so unprepared that I think Jimmy Carter was the president. And the region had formed this Mahoning Valley Economic Development Corporation. So a group of all these business leaders, political leaders, flew to Chicago to meet with the regional director of the Economic Development Administration. I went as a reporter. And there was this huge conference room, and he comes in, and he's got all his assistants, and all of our locals are sitting around the table. And so he asked them, what was going on, and they told him the story of the closing of the mills and the collapse of the economy, foreclosures that Traficant refused to foreclose on. Remember?
Oh yeah, he made national news with that.
So he knew a lot of those stories, but he also wanted some insight. And then he asked this question, and that was the lead of the story I wrote. He says, what do you want to do now that you don't have the mills? And not one of the people at that table could answer the question.
Well, and
because they said, we are not prepared for this. We didn't think this was going to happen.
And then we spent the next 10 years with the Ecumenical Coalition trying to bring the steel mills back and reopen them. So we lost 10 years, crucial years, I think.
Yeah, and during that time, and during that period, Jimmy Carter had made promises to this region, and his campaign was run by two very prominent people, Johnny Vitullo and Russell Sadie, I'm sure.
Right.
And they were very much involved in Jimmy Carter's campaign. And so when he got elected in the White House, he actually appointed somebody to deal with old steel regions like the Mahoning Valley. And as Cindy was talking about, the coalition wanted to reopen the giant mills.
Right.
Carter came up with an idea. He said, listen, we'll set aside $100 million loan guarantees, but the money can only be used for micro mills, the ones like we have at Belleric.
Right.
Okay? You can't reopen the big steel mills like Donald Trump is promising to do.
Right.
It just doesn't work that way.
Right.
You don't need 10,000 people working in the mills.
And it's all computerized.
And our locals, and the locals said no. They said, we need to reopen these mills. There are a lot of people who need the jobs. And they said, those days are gone. Yeah. The old days of steel making are gone. And we just couldn't, in our minds, wrap our minds around that, saying,
there are still some people here that think the mills are going to come back, but mostly it's older now because, as time goes on, now we're looking at 40 plus years, there's a lot of younger people that have no idea what the city of Youngstown was like when this place was booming, when we had 160,000 people living here. They have no idea. And they keep, tearing down all the factories, the skeletons of all these factories. So now you don't even know that, that used to be a lamp plant on this corner. Oh, we used to make desks and stuff on this corner. Oh, now that it's all flattened, it's just another empty lot. And a lot of these people just take for granted what we have going on, not realizing our past and how prosperous. I mean, I know what a prosperous Youngstown looked like.
Oh, sure.
With real prosperity. And I mean, even if you look back and say like the Vindicator back in the day, if you look back at some of those old papers, I look at those things and I go, damn, look at these ads in here.
The Thanksgiving paper.
Your paper boy was...
The carriers would have back problems.
Right. But it's just, and let's talk here a minute about all the broken promises. Do you write about any of these politicians with broken promises? Probably the string of broken promises that everybody has come in here since 1977. You could probably write a book on that alone.
And there was one, I will tell you, I wrote a lot about those, the CAC.
I don't know that any of them made the book, though, did they?
No, because I was writing as a reporter, as a columnist, but I wrote about the Commuter Aircraft Corporation, I wrote about all of the other things. The one that I supported, and people think I supported two, Ronenberg Brewery, that was going to open down at the B&O. It was a German company that had teamed up with J.J. Cafaro. They were going to bring the first microbrewery in America to Youngstown. All of the financing was in place. They were bringing their German, expertise in beer making. Yeah. There were going to be these huge brass vats in the windows so people could actually see the beer making. But it was going to be a microbrewery. This was even before Budweiser decided to go off and do it.
Right.
The plan fell apart because when they went to the federal government for financing, the federal government said, they looked at all of the financing and they said it's about $1.5 million short in private equity. And said to JJ and said to the Cafaros, I think we would like you to pledge a little more. And Bill Cafaro said no. And that project died because we would have had the first microbrewery in America. And it was, and this was a German royal family that owned a brewery in Germany, and I'd met them, and they were just very rich people,
right,
who had long history of making beer. That I regretted because I think that would have been a great project. And the other one I love that everybody thinks I'm nuts was the blimps.
Okay.
I love that project.
I still have a bumper sticker somewhere with the blimp and it says Youngstown or whatever.
I thought that was the greatest project because it was just fun to have.
Yeah.
But I thought too that they could use those for surveillance. Cheap.
Oh yeah.
You could do Coast Guard. You could use it for surveillance, and then
that was before drones.
Now early day drones.
And the company that was going to build here ended up building a plant in Toronto. Now, people think I'm crazy for wanting to have that project, but I thought it was just a great, nice, it's a different kind of project.
Well, we got the chill can coming. We'll get ready for the chill can.
And unfortunately, and unfortunately, there are other companies that are already now making.
What do you think it is? Why does it seem like there's this cloud hanging over the Youngstown area?
Here's our problem: is the brain drain. There are kids who leave this area to go off to college and not coming back.
I got 2.
Is that right?
You're right, yeah.
They're out of this area?
Yeah, they went to Florida.
Did they really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And what was their reason for not wanting to live here?
Nothing there for them. One's a nurse, and the other one works for the Toronto Blue Jays down there.
Was that right?
And he works in the baseball, but they just like it down there. It's just even the vibe, everything. It's not like every single store on every single corner is closed down, or you could go to certain parts of town or whatever, and it's just it's just a totally different vibe.
And I think that was where we failed. The discussion from the leaders, political and business and community leaders, were all about how do we reopen mills, or how do we get back the jobs we lost, the blue-collar jobs. I don't think in those years, when I was writing about this 40 years ago, there was any discussion about how do we keep our young people here? What do we need to do to keep them here? How can YSU be the best #1 institution for something, whatever it is? How do we do those things? And I think, so young people, you're right, like your kids say, you want us to come back to what? And now with this America Makes and, the additive manufacturing and all of those things, and so you have
it's taken us 40 years to get
right.
Yeah.
So you have a steel mill out at Belleric, which is the French company that owns it. 400 and something people.
Yeah.
They're getting paid very well, but it's mostly computerized.
Yep.
It's not the same old mill.
No.
And so I think our problem was there wasn't enough attention being paid to young people and what their needs were and how we keep them in a region. And then, of course, you have a large senior citizen population.
Oh, yeah.
You have a large population on fixed income.
Yep.
But I think that's the strength of Jim Trussell. He and I have kind of differing opinions about Jim Trussell, but I think that's the strength of Jim Trussell, is that he focuses on the kids. He did when he was a coach. He does as a university president, and he's renovating the old misdemeanor jail down here for
the Innovation Center.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think YSU is probably the key to our development. I mean, when you look at even some of those areas on the north side that fell into blight and were falling apart, and now they're getting all sucked up by the university and new apartments and new university buildings.
It is amazing when you drive through there. I mean, in the 40 years that we've lived on the north side, the houses are gone, those dilapidated houses are gone. It is amazing how much property the university has taken over and renovated,
and for the good. So who knows? You start with a strong university like that, and you could go anywhere. You look at even places like, say, Morgantown, West Virginia. Look at what the university does for Morgantown, West Virginia. It would probably almost look like this practically if they didn't have that university there.
I'll acknowledge my columns about Trussell weren't exactly positive.
Okay, give us a little insight to your column on Trussell.
There's a chapter in there on YSU. I did not believe he should be president of YSU, and so I was not a supporter of his.
Okay.
When he was being appointed, and I was concerned about his reputation at Ohio State with all that controversy, the NCAA violations, and all of that. And so
she's shaking her head no.
I just thought that whole thing was insane. I just thought it was insane.
and so the columns do reflect my opposition to his being appointed president. But the introduction to the chapter, there is a paragraph that she insisted on as the editor. That's very complimentary of Jim.
Okay.
So I concede, since I wasn't paying her to work on this book, I conceded that she can write that paragraph. And so.
Oh man. Okay. So you wrote about Trafficant and Trestle and who else?
There's who else
did you have in there? What other? What other people like say on the Mount Rushmore of Youngstown have you voiced your opinion about here in this book?
He wrote about DeWine.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
And the whole Oak Hill controversy and DeWine giving Tony Cafero a pass. I was very critical of him, and he knew it. Just before, in fact, when the paper announced its closing, DeWine called me, and I'd known him a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he was coming to town, he wanted to talk to me and all of that. And he says, you don't understand. And I said, listen, I said, I concede that we were not able to police ourselves. That's why I love the idea of the feds being involved in going after organized crime. Had the feds not done it, organized crime would still be in existence in the Mahoning Valley, because we were not going to do it our own. I mean, Phil Chance was sheriff and was
we know what
playing
happened
footsies with the mob. I mean,
right. You know, that's another thing. What do you think when you hear some people still say, boy, this town was a lot better off when the mob run things? I'm sure you hear that all the time.
I've said to people, when Youngstown had the highest per capita homicide rate, I used to tell people, I live in the safest neighborhood because Joey Naples is my neighbor. And
you're going after these guys.
Gangbangers are never going to come to my neighborhood.
Yeah,
that's your own protection.
Yes.
That's kind of funny.
But we do. There's a chapter on Youngstown, and you know the problems Youngstown has had. You know, Pat Angaro was mayor. You remember Pat?
Yep.
He did a lot for downtown development and all of that. But there are some, unfortunately, the population of Youngstown has declined and decreased to such an extent that there are more people, more residents of Youngstown who do not pay income tax than those who do, because a lot of them are on fixed incomes.
Oh, right.
And so it's difficult to have a city like that where you're depending on out-of-towners who work in the city to pay the income
government
tax.
funding.
And government funding.
All right. You know, we still have the same miles of roads. We still have,
exactly.
There's just so much that you have to look at that you still have to pay.
Right.
Whether there's 500 people or 5,000 people who live in there, you still got these expenses, and you need those people
Yes.
So we're really in a pickle.
We really are. And we proposed, and Sidney was a big advocate of nonpartisan elections.
Big advocate.
Because, as you know, if you're a Democrat and you live in this area, the actual election occurs in the primary.
Right.
And I've always been an independent, so I don't get to vote.
And I've never voted in primaries
I'm left
because
with
I couldn't.
everybody else's choices.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And so, you know, for a city like ours, we really do need nonpartisan elections. I believe we need to reform city government so that there's a strong city manager form of government, not strong mayor and council, because you don't get the best and the brightest running for office, especially
Absolutely.
in a city like
Hey, let's go back to some of these columns now about the corruption. Right. What was it in our DNA, especially let's go back to 93, 94, when every judge, it seemed like every judge and Phil Chance
and the
prosecutor, everybody got busted. Let's talk a little bit about that.
You know, there's something about, there are rich people in our community, and those rich people need to own others who are not so rich. And once they own them, then you get the favors. You get invited to their parties. You get to sit with them at the big round table in the restaurants. You get to, when you're running for re-election, you get money, finance,
you get the private jet rides.
You get all of those things that come. So our politicians sort of look at the landscape and say, okay, I can be the best damn public servant in the world and end my career poor.
Right.
Or I can use politics for my own benefit. And so what has happened to us is that you get these people running for office whose concept of public service isn't what we believe it should be. And to me, the biggest example of that was Oak Hill. I did a lot about the Oak Hill Renaissance controversy where Anthony Caffaro Sr. did not want the county commissioners to buy the old Southside Medical Center because he had Job and Family Services at the McGuffey Mall, and he didn't want to lose that rent, okay, and that great lease. And I was able to get documents that showed Tony Caffaro and others in the Caffaro company calling, at the time, Commissioner McNally, let's see, Shortino, Lisa Antonini, and all of that. And I was looking at these calls, and one day after I'd written a column, I get a call from one of the politicians who said to me, "You're missing the point. These elected officials are responding to their constituent." I said, number one, Tony Caffaro is in Trumbull County, not in Mahoning County, but be that as it may, he had his headquarters on Belmont Avenue in Mahoning County. I said, that's fine. I said, but let me ask you this question. I said, let me ask you this question. I said, I know a woman on the South Side who had sewage in her basement. And after I started writing these columns about Caffaro and his influence, she called me. And she says, I read your column and I looked at the timeline of all of these calls and these meetings and all this man Mr. Caffaro was able to have with all of the elected officials. And she said, I called the county commissioner's office to have somebody, she said, I'm a senior citizen, I live alone, to have somebody deal with the sewage in my basement. And she said, I had to go to 4 different offices because they kept sending me somewhere else. Yeah. And she said, I finally was able to find somebody who would even listen to me.
Yeah.
And I said,
I think that says it all right there.
And I said, I get these calls on a daily basis from people saying, who do I call? I said, I can pick up a phone and get anybody in government on the phone.
Right.
But that's because of me.
Right.
It's not because of, because they want to do...
if you weren't doing the job that you were doing, you couldn't call down there and get that same response. You couldn't get that action.
That's unfair. That's right.
Yeah.
I said, that's unfair to our people. Why should some people, because they won the lottery of life, get all of the favors, and others have to jump through hoops in order to get somebody to actually respond to them?
It's a very easy thing that you learned in kindergarten or whatever. Fair is fair.
Yeah, exactly.
How many times you heard that when you were a little kid? That was just like one of the mantras. Hey, fair is fair.
Yeah.
And I think
that's what happened with our government corruption. All of these guys were easy pickings for those who had money.
They're in for themselves. And
here, if we talk about government corruption, Filomena. I supported Jimmy Filomena when he first ran for office. I thought he was a brilliant lawyer, well-spoken, well-educated, made a great appearance, dressed well. And then all of a sudden, we started finding out what was going on, and as Paul Gaines said, justice for sale. Mm-hmm. They used to fix traffic tickets.
The good old days. See, back in those days, that's my days in Youngstown. That's what I lament. I miss the good old days.
So you get a traffic ticket.
So there was this kid from Canfield who got his 3rd drug charge, and he had been accepted to the military academy. Now, 3 kicks you out of the academy, okay? His father, he got it reduced to reckless act. He was driving drunk, high, for $10,000. Some poor schlub on the lower South Side is sitting in jail.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That, to me, is the most egregious thing about what has happened to this region and to government.
I agree 100%. And that's why I used to, the guys that used to really piss me off the most, though, that finally got busted were these judges, the judges and the prosecutors, where these judges would get some guy in there like me or whatever, and sit there and browbeat you and beat you down, and the next thing you know, I mean, even if you follow the Youngstown courts like on a daily basis, maybe somebody gets arrested for no driver's license, and maybe they're trying to get to work. That's the only way they can get to work. Not that it's right, but instead of giving these guys a pass or look, hey, let's help you out, they impound their car, then you're on high risk insurance, and then you got these reinstatement fees that you can't make. And this is somebody that might be on welfare or might be working a $10 an hour part-time job at McDonald's, and you bury this guy so far, these thousands start adding up, and it's like, okay, how do you expect this guy to even get out of this hole where you got these people, okay, yeah, we'll throw 10 grand your way, and all of a sudden it's I wouldn't have a problem if they did it for everybody.
Exactly.
You know what? If this guy comes in and says, look, man, I know I didn't have a driver's license, I know I didn't have insurance, I need this car to get to work, I can't afford the impound, what could you do to help me? And then they say, you know what, yeah, this poor bastard here, he could use a little hand, we're going to let him go too. If you do it for everybody, then I don't have a problem. Yeah. But if it's selective and this guy gets it, but this guy don't, and I think that might even, when you look at it, get into some of the Black Lives Matters things, where these people that are oppressed feel like, hey, look,
the justice system doesn't work for everybody.
The system is doing this for them, and it's doing this for this other guy because he has money. And I could see where there's some sort of resentment
to that. And it even worse than that. For example, when Philomena was a prosecutor, there were certain lawyers you knew you had to go to because they were part of the network.
Right.
Yeah.
And they all charged. They knew.
Oh, yeah.
Don't worry about it. We can get that reduced, or we can, it'll disappear. But.
Right.
And so if you can afford to pay that but, whatever it is, it'll cost you so and so, you're fine. You're lucky. But if you can't afford to pay it,
then you're going to jail. They're impounding your car. You'll never get your car back because the impound fee is going to be so high you'll never get it back. You'll be buried. You'll never be able to get a driver's license because you're not going to be able to pay the insurance. You're not going to be able to pay the reinstatement fees, all that. See, that's the difference, though, between friends helping friends. Because the real definition of friends helping friends is you do something for me and you do it because it's from the goodness of your heart.
And you also do it for the least of us, those who cannot afford it.
Right.
I mean, you don't do it for the ones who
can afford it the most. Yeah, right. These people can afford it the most. And
funny story. So I end up getting a DUI. Okay, and I was drunk, and it was a stupid thing I did.
Right.
So Hannah finds out about it. He calls me up, and he says, you got a DUI. I said, yeah. He says, well, I can, we don't have to do anything. You can do reckless op or whatever. And I said, no, we can't do that. So then he says to me, so what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to plead no contest, and I'm probably, whatever the sentence is. Judge Levy was the municipal court judge. I said, I'll have to take, and I talked to the owners of the paper. I talked to the editor. I offered to resign. They said, don't be stupid, you just go.
I even got called in about that.
Yes. So anyway. So then Hannah says, I'll tell you what, why don't you go and spend 3 days for the weekend in jail? I said, this is like those bad movies.
Yeah.
Where the guy goes up to jail and disappears.
Yeah.
And never
Especially
see him.
you. Yeah.
Never see him again.
Who would be that never solved that one. Who would be responsible for this guy's disappearance? I haven't a clue. I don't know. The list of suspects is this long.
So I said, no, that's okay. So I did the 3 day of school, and my license was suspended for a year, and she had to drive.
Oh, boy.
She wasn't allowed to drive my car.
Yeah. And so,
insurance said no way.
But the first instinct was, because I was somebody who was in a position of influence, was it can disappear.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, no. I mean, that's not how the system isn't supposed to work like that.
Yeah.
And that's what, you're right. That's what makes government corruption so bad or so egregious in our region, is that the benefits accrued to those
who really don't need it.
Who don't need it.
Well, look what happened out in California with those celebrities paying their kids way into Ivy League schools for, relying on the applications. They weren't even athletes.
Yeah.
I think it happens.
And I think the chapter on political corruption sort of lays out and shows why I think people will get the bottom line being the system isn't supposed to work like this.
See, I give you a lot of credit for that. You told the story about your dad.
Right.
There have been a lot of people said, what, I think I'll do it, or even something like that. Okay, yeah, you know what, yeah, get me out of this, and we'll do it. But you took the you didn't compromise on that.
And I think that you're right. The first time you say yes, the perfect crime is committed by the person who commits the crime, and he or she is the only one who knows the crime has been committed. Because the moment you share that, then there's no longer a secret.
Right.
You're right. The first time you take, that's it.
Yeah. I'll give you an example. One time I was about, I don't know, maybe I was a teenager, a little older, somewhere maybe 20 years old. And I was involved in a minor traffic accident. Very, very minor. And I was jerking around, and I hit a little tree on this guy's devil strip, and most of the devil strip was gravel, and there was this little tree, and I broke this tree. So next thing you know, I end up going to court, and Levy was the judge, and this guy come in with a estimate of damages from Jeep Garano's landscaping company. Oh, you mentioned Jeep in here? Okay. So, and it was from Jeep Garano's landscaping company.
Me,
And he was, and it was for $2,000, some astronomical amount of damage. And it wasn't, even when the cops showed up to look at this, the cop even told the guy, goes, do you even want to pursue this? I'm going to teach this little punk a lesson and everything. So, and then, like I say, I go to court, and then this guy comes out with this thing from Jeep Garano for $3,000 in damage or something, and Levy was right there and ruled in his favor.
He ruled in his favor?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you're kidding.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Well,
so what do you have to say about Jeep?
After I wrote a column about he would release, it was about his connections and all of that. His family sued me, and so the Vindicator had a lawyer on retainer out of Cleveland, a very good media lawyer, one of the best in the country, David Marburger, who's defended me on several lawsuits over the years.
Many of us.
Many of us. So I contacted him, and he said we had a meeting and all of that. So the family, his lawyer, we had a deposition. So I'm sitting across the table from them, and they're asking me questions and about how did the column come about. And I said, it's all based on facts. It's based on court documents and all this kind of thing. And then he says, what was the date that you wrote the column? And it was in early spring. And I told him, and I had the copy of the column. And he says, you realize what that means, right? And I said, no. He says, you have affected this business. And I said, what are you talking about? He says, well, it is the planting season, and that's when they start, and you have affected their whole business. And I said, look at me, do I know about planting? And at that point, the lawyer looks at my lawyer and said, let's go have a meeting outside. And he came back and said, fine, and they dropped the case. I said, come on.
Well, see, obviously, though, that's why I had to pay $3,000 for that one little tree out there because of you. Now, I don't know if I like this guy now.
I can't believe that Luke did that to you.
Oh yeah, man. They brought that thing in, and that was it. Now, so you've been sued on several occasions?
A lot of times.
And you come out on top?
The Vindicator has always defended me. And they paid for the lawyer, and I've never been found guilty of
Now, and that's because you check all your facts, right?
That's
the main thing. You would check all your facts.
And the other thing is, my columns are opinion,
right?
Which is a different category from actually having a news story,
right?
And so there's always that issue about, is it really opinion or is it based on? And I said, hey, this is my opinion. The group that I always wanted to sue me were the mobsters. Because once you get a lawsuit, once you're sued, you get to depose the party that's suing you. And I always wanted to be able to have a deposition for all these mobsters.
Yeah, we have a few questions here we'd like to ask you about this landscaping business or whatever. Right.
But no, they never sued. And the others politicians, one politician I wrote about him saying that he had absolutely no qualifications to get the job that he got. And he sued me, and the judge said, "You don't have any qualifications." I mean,
right. Well, so what happens then? These guys see that, they get pissed off. Like, oh, we're going to get Bertram, we're going to get the Vindicator, we're going to shut them down.
They threaten to cancel subscriptions and do all that kind of stuff. But over the years, when Cindy started and when I started, the Vindicator was we were the 8th largest newspaper in Ohio. We were powerful. We really were for a family-owned regional newspaper. We were 3 counties in Ohio, and then of course 2 counties in Western PA. Huge circulation. We had all kinds of bureaus and all of that. People recognized the power of the newspaper, and people would want our endorsements. They want to, and that's why Traficant was always resentful that he never got the support of the Vindicator. So much so that when he was proposing the Covelli Center, not the Covelli Center, the
Convocation.
Youngstown Convocation Center, right.
The first person he asked to serve on the committee was the owner of the newspaper, Betty Brown Jacknow. He wanted her on there. Trying to sort of say, listen, I'm no longer the guy I used to be kind of thing.
Right.
But no, we were powerful. It was a powerful newspaper. The state government recognized that. Endorsements mattered. If we endorsed somebody for governor, we could depend on the fact that if there was something that was needed for the region, that would,
There were lots of state and national politicians that came through our doors, and they all sought our endorsement.
See, that's why I think a lot of people don't realize what a big blow to our community was losing the Youngstown Vindicator or local newspapers in general, because where are you going to get like these people speaking out against anything now? I think this opens the door for people to just run amok because they have nobody there to hold them accountable or to hold their feet to the fire.
There's no filter for what's out there.
Yeah.
So a lot of people who just, for example, watch Fox News believe everything they see on Fox News. And there's no sort of, and people don't recognize that when I was a reporter, when she was a reporter, you had to have 2 or 3 sources for a story.
If you had an anonymous source, you had to confirm it with other sources. And I think some of the national news still does that. But the New York Times did a story recently that said, I think almost half of the newspapers in the country have closed in the last 15 years. And those that haven't closed, their staffs have been gutted. Yeah. So investigative journalism has just plummeted. It's difficult to do that right now because it's so expensive.
And so there's no watchdog.
And people don't realize that. What do you guys, now you're both journalists, longtime journalists, what do you think of the term fake news? What does that set you through the roof whenever you hear somebody say fake news?
She's much more passionate about this than I am, so go ahead.
It boils my blood, honestly, what's happening in the country right now. I just, and the sad part is that, it has always been in a democracy that it's the obligation and responsibility of the private citizen to inform themselves. And that's not happening now. They're running to Facebook and Google, and half of that stuff on there isn't from bona fide journalists. And when all of the bona fide news outlets are gone, there won't be anything on Google and Facebook. And I don't think a lot of these young kids realize that. They don't recognize what's happening. And this fake news business is just, it's a ploy to, gain followers
and people don't understand this is Trump, right? Before he was president, Trump used to reach out to all these media outlets that now he's calling fake news. Yeah. Because every time, he would call the New York papers and use another name to say, "Oh, heard this about Donald Trump." He would be the one calling, right? Heard this about Donald Trump. And he did this constantly because he realized that if his name appeared in the New York Times, his name appeared in the Wall Street Journal, if his name appeared in the tabloids or even in the Washington Post, it meant something. So at those years, his followers don't realize that's how he created his image. Yeah. And now it's all fake news because they don't agree with him.
Now, see, that worries me because now there's just this overall distrust for journalism. Yes. Yes. And now, how do you guys feel about that? That people just say, oh, you know, it's all fake. It's not real. This guy's got an agenda. And
I think he's been very successful in convincing people that that's what's happening. And the thing that worries me is I'm the daughter of an ex-POW from World War II. That's exactly what happened in Germany. The first thing that you do when you want to control a country is to discredit the press. And he's been very successful in doing that.
Yeah, I think you see that sometimes. Everybody talks about like the Second Amendment, but people forget all about the First Amendment and why the Founding Fathers found that so important, that we have a free press. And but like you say, now you get all this information from whoever. Anybody could sit there, anybody could have a blog, anybody could get on there. If you come across as somewhat presentable and you give your point in kind of a forceful way, it almost doesn't matter what you're saying. I see that happen all the time. There's one floating around out on Facebook right now, and it's like about LeBron James said he's going to quit the NBA if they don't stop playing the national anthem. Completely false. Exactly. It's absolutely false. He never said that, and people spread that around like it's the gospel truth. And there's no checks or balances on this stuff. And I think more people, before they post something, should always look and see what the source is, or, you know, check it out a little bit before you just start running off and, oh, somebody just posted this on Facebook, I believe it, you know?
Yeah, you know, I don't think it's going to change until a blogger or a series of bloggers gets sued the way we used to get sued.
The libel laws should apply.
Yeah, exactly.
The libel laws that apply to newspapers should apply to these online entities, because then you are under obligation to make sure that whatever you're publishing is accurate.
Right.
It's factual. It's fact-based.
And that errors are not intentional.
Exactly.
And do you think that there's this blurred line now between commentary and real news? Do you think that line is more blurred than ever before?
Oh, absolutely. Because here's what I used to tell people. I started as a reporter, so I was on the news side, like Cindy was. And then I moved to editorial, and I used to write editorials and write my column. But there were 2 pages set aside. That was the editorial page and the commentary page. Those pages were managed directly by the owners of the newspaper, so that there was a very clear distinction wall between the news department and editorial. And I would tell people, because reporters would come to me and say, so-and-so was angry about an editorial you wrote or a column you wrote. And I said, here's what you need to tell them. Agree with them that the people who are writing the editorials and the people and Bertram who's writing his column are all idiots. They don't know what the hell's going on. I said, it'll make you feel good. You'll get along with the guy you're talking to. I said, but it also shows there's a clear distinction between commentary, opinion, and news. There isn't that today. Mm-mm. And I think that's where people don't realize that, you know, there is a difference between expressing your own opinion and actually doing a straight news story.
And I think, do you feel that some of the younger journalists today have gotten away from that? You know, instead of who, what, where, when, why, how, the basics. Do you feel that is still what it should be? And if this guy says something, and then you go ask another source that says maybe something else, and then you sit there and figure it out. Well, you know what? I kind of like what that guy said. I don't think what this guy said is right. And it just seems like some people these days, they're just like parrots. They see something, and that line is blurred. And then it automatically becomes fact, and you know.
I think the pressure on mainstream media is so great today that, you know, we're finding ourselves trying to figure out, okay, how do we compete with the Facebooks, with Twitter, with you know,
CNN,
how do you compete with them where you're trying to walk this very straight and narrow line as a journalist.
Right.
And then the next call you get is from somebody saying, I read your story. It's all crap because I saw it on Fox and here's what they said, or I saw it on the internet and here's what they've said. Why don't you have that in your story? And you say, well, because that's not a fact. Yeah. And they don't want to buy that. They say, well, it's out there. Everybody's reading it. And so I think the pressure is, I think there's going to come a time when we have to redefine what news is and how you report that news. And I'm lucky that we are out of the business, because I would not be comfortable with that at all.
I don't know what they're teaching in journalism schools right now, but I hope they're still teaching, the 5 W's and how, but it's hard to tell. I know that the young kids that have gone on from the Vindicator in the last few years and are working at bigger papers, they still adhere to those standards. So I don't think it's dead, but I do think it's difficult to...
Right. Now, I see like a lot of bad reporting, though. Now, don't you think if you were writing, say, a story on COVID, wouldn't you get, okay, this doctor said this, but then don't you go talk to somebody else? The real, true, fair, and balanced. That would be, okay, in your story, you have this guy says this, and that guy says that. Or Black Lives Matter says this, but the police say that. And you lay it out, but it seems like sometimes now it does get slanted and the lines get blurred. I think, what I think the problem is? I think we just have too much information and people can't process it properly. I mean, how did we get by when we had the Vindicator and 3 TV networks, and if you wanted a little more in-depth, then you would read the New York, you'd read Time or magazines and Newsweek and things like that, where you would have well-written, in-depth stories and you could read it. But I think people now, they just get all this garble and then just whoever forces their will the most, or whatever it seems to me.
I mean, you're in the business, so you must have heard that that Americans can't really focus longer than 15 seconds.
Right.
So they tell you that if you're going to make these videos, that to keep them to 15 seconds, because that's about all people can concentrate on. So that does make it difficult to say, oh, I'm going to go read a story out of Time magazine, which might take me 15 or 20 minutes.
Yeah. And I might have to read it twice because I didn't really quite follow what that guy was saying.
Right.
And the other problem, too, is time. There's so much more going on, because when I first started, and we used to go out for Sunday breakfast, and you'd walk into Perkins, just about every table had the Sunday Vindicator. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they'd all be reading it, and they'd be sharing sections. Somebody would have the sports section, somebody would have entertainment, society, and all of that. They don't do that anymore. You don't see that.
No.
Well,
and what would happen was, because I'd watch this, I'd be at a different table, and I'd watch a table where everybody was reading, and somebody would say something, go, hey, did you see this? And they would read it out, and then there would be a discussion at the table about what that meant or what it was. That's all lost. I mean, we're all in this little bubble of ours.
Oh, yeah. Each read our own little thing.
You're not sharing, you're not discussing.
If it's a meme and it says this, that must mean that, this guy is that. Or the candidate I oppose, there's something here because it says a meme of a funny thing. Maybe it was even sent out there by the Russians or whoever, But I think that's one thing that I don't think that we have anymore in journalism, with all these different sources out there, is you're not really getting people that just sit there and dig and get the story and get all the facts straight and present it in a balanced way where you could sit there and say, okay, I agree with that guy, I disagree with that guy, and so on. So that's and
it's sort of depressing, because the more people don't feel a sense of community. I believe newspapers create a sense of community. Even with families, Cindy's parents would read the paper at the table, drinking their coffee, and at one point smoking cigarettes.
Yeah.
But they would be reading the paper cover to cover, and they would talk, and then they would ask, when I'd walk in, they would read a column or something I'd written or something that Cindy had written, and they would ask about it. it was this whole thing that everybody was getting involved because they were able to sort of share that information. There is none now.
No.
You know, you post something and all of a sudden it takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
Whether it's legitimate or not.
Sometimes I think we get way too many people's opinions. I think that's another thing.
Exactly.
Because now everybody that has an opinion, whether it's credible or not, it's out there.
Yes.
You know, and it's just like, okay, well.
But I think you're right. It is kind of hard to file through all of that stuff and process it and figure out what's right. There's a lot of stuff out there.
And for us, one of my greatest concerns was this thing called community journalism, where people out in the community were sort of were being acknowledged even by newspapers as, well, you know, they should be able to write something and all. And I, very frankly, at the Vindicator, when I was the editorial page editor, one of the editors approached me and said, well, I've got 2 or 3 people who want to write columns. And I said, are they journalists? He said, no. He said, they're in the community and they want to write columns. And I said, what kind of columns? Well, I'm not going to ask them, but you know, I think we should consider that. And I said, hold on a minute. Who's going to fact check? We don't have the staff. I said, do you realize when we run letters to the editor, we actually do our own fact checking before we publish a letter to the editor? And we've rejected a lot of letters that make statements that are not based on any fact or truth. I said, how are we going to do this? And I said, guess what? Even if it's somebody out in the community writing a column, we get sued. Guess who's on the hook for that lawsuit?
Oh, right.
And he seems to say, well, you know, this is the future of journalism. And I said, no, that's not the future of journalism. I said, if we open up our pages to anyone in the community who thinks they have an opinion to express or want to write something, we are opening up ourselves to all kinds of problems. And that's what worries me. And then there are papers that have done that you know, go out into the community and encourage people to write. And I'm thinking, you know, you better be sure that whatever's being published is fact.
Right.
So,
well, guys, I think we're just about out of time, man. It's just about time to wrap things up. A great show here this afternoon. Like I say, it's
Freddie.
a little different than the roads I usually go down, but I think it was a very interesting conversation. And I think the book is called No Holds Barred, and this is pretty much a history of Youngstown for the past 30 years. And it's about all the stuff that we talked about the corruption, about the mob, and it's all in here.
It's on sale right now on our website, Scribbler Group. www.scribblegroup.com.
Oh, yeah, okay.
But it's also going to be on sale starting the 29th.
Oh, this is an advanced copy.
Yeah, that's
man.
At Barnes and Noble.
Actually, they're in.
Oh,
they came in and they've been on sale for a few weeks. But
you're making me feel special. Come on now. Now I feel bad. I thought I was going to go put this on eBay right away.
No, you are the
one of the early ones to get it.
We just shipped the ones that were ordered online.
Yeah.
So they haven't received them yet. So you're the first one about this.
Okay, so now you have a podcast, website. Right. Give us all that information.
The website is the...
Well, I just wanted to say that Barnes & Noble is going to start selling it next Tuesday.
On the 29th.
So
that'll be great.
And we're going to have a virtual author discussion on the 28th. At 6 o'clock, Barnes & Noble is hosting it, and then it's live on their Facebook page.
Oh, that'll be great. That'll be great.
And the library is also going to do one further on in October.
Cynthia Rickard, Bertram de Souza, I want to thank you guys for taking some time. Like I say, this is a little departure from what I do, but I'm branching out into some different areas, and I think we had a very interesting conversation.
It was a great conversation because talking to somebody who we didn't have to explain a lot about. It's really, frankly, there are a lot of people who don't know the kind of background information or the history like you do.
Oh, here's one for you. Who, if they ever made a movie about the Mahoning Valley, who would you have played Don Hanai?
There's a column about that.
Oh, is it really? And Traficant too? Yeah. All right, we'll have to read the book to see the answer. We're not giving everything away from the book. There's a column
there about who would play the mobsters, the various mobsters who would play Hanai.
Oh, okay, that's going to be the first one I read when we wrap up here this afternoon. Okay, that's a good one. So the answer right here as to who Bertram de Souza is going to cast for the Mahoning Valley.
If you look at the back of the book, there's a quote from Jim Traficant that I think you'll find.
If you come out with something harsher than my ability to expel you, get ready for a fist fight. See, that's just Youngstown, Ohio, though. That is Youngstown, Ohio. Yes. We're going to have a fist fight.
And then continue reading.
Other than that, give me the news, because Mr. De Souza is here from the Vindicator, and if you want to deframe, if you want to be defamed, there's nobody in America that can defame you like De Souza.
That was during the ethics hearing before they expelled him. And after he said that, the reporters from Washington all came to me and said, how often does this happen? I said, all the time.
Yeah, this is just a weekly thing. The book is called No Holds Barred.
Thank you,
Make sure you check it out. If you want to see the history of Youngstown through Bert's eyes, and just to see where we've been over the last 30 years and where we're heading, it's a great book.
Thank you.
Guys, thanks for stopping by. I had an awesome time here today.
Thank you. I did too. Thanks.
Okay,
Thanks
very
a lot.
good. All right, time to